in the heart of Harlem, under the dark cover of night. The air was thick with tension. The quiet of the city, usually alive with the sounds of jazz and street vendors, had turned to stillness, as though the streets themselves knew what was coming. This wasn't just any night. It was the night a hit squad was sent for Bumpy Johnson, but only one would return. The hit squad, 12 men strong, had been sent by a rival faction that saw Bumpy's power as a threat. Harlem was his domain, his empire, one built on years of loyalty, respect, and calculated moves in the underworld. The rival gang had seen Bumpy's rise and sought to take what was his. They believed they could wipe him off the map. But they underestimated not just Bumpy, but Harlem itself. It was supposed to be simple. 12 men, well armed, slipping into Harlem under the cover of darkness and eliminating the legendary kingpin. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who could be hunted like prey. The sound of boots hitting the pavement echoed through the alleyways. The men moved swiftly, their footsteps the only noise breaking the eerie silence. They knew this wasn't just another job. It was an execution. But what they didn't know was that they weren't the ones in control. Not anymore. As they neared their target, they felt it, the sudden weight of the streets closing in on them. The game was no longer in their hands. And then, in the distance, a figure stepped from the shadows, like a storm suddenly breaking the calm. Bumpy Johnson. He stood still, his face a mask of calm defiance as the men closed in, guns drawn, ready to kill. But Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even move a muscle. His reputation alone had already done half the work. He wasn't just a man. He was a force, a living legend who had earned the loyalty of the people and the respect of the streets. The squad's leader, a ruthless man by the name of Tony the Hammer Rodriguez, signaled for the first shot. But before the sound of the gun could even register in the air, it was already too late. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born into greatness. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, nor was he handed a throne. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy grew up in a world where the deck was stacked against him from the start. But he was the survivor. He knew that power wasn't just about what you had. It was about what you could take, what you could hold on to, and how much respect you could command. Harlem in the 1920s was a world where power was taken, not given. A neighborhood defined by crime, jazz, and a rising black community that refused to back down from oppression. This was where Bumpy found his footing, cutting his teeth in the world of bootlegging, gambling, and street politics. By the early 1930s, he had already built an empire, not with a tyrant's fist, but through a quiet dominance that was rooted in loyalty and respect. Bumpy had learned early that trust was everything. He wasn't just a street boss. He was a protector of Harlem, a place that had seen its fair share of trouble from both outsiders and law enforcement. Bumpy's influence stretched beyond the criminal underworld. He had connections with politicians, with business owners, and with the people who walked the streets of Harlem every day. To them, Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was the man who ensured their survival in a world that often seemed determined to crush them. The people of Harlem didn't fear Bumpy. They respected him. He had proven time and again that he would fight for them even when no one else would. Whether it was dealing with corrupt police officers or rival gangsters trying to take his turf, Bumpy always came out on top, and that was why no one dared to challenge him. At least, not until that night. But even the fiercest warriors have their enemies, and in the cutthroat world of organized crime, Bumpy had made a few. One of those enemies was a man named Vincent Dutch Schultz, a mobster with his eyes set on expanding his operations into Harlem. Dutch saw Bumpy's power as a threat, an obstacle in his path to controlling the entire city. So he did what any man with ambition and no morals would do. He sent a hit squad, 12 men, trained killers, armed and ready to take down the legend who had built Harlem into his own kingdom. They had no idea what they were walking into. The order had been simple. Take Bumpy out. And the men who had been dispatched to do it were experienced, deadly, and unafraid. Dutch Schultz believed that with the right amount of force, the right intimidation, he could wipe Bumpy from the streets of Harlem and take his place at the top. After all, who was Bumpy Johnson? Just another man with a reputation. But what Dutch didn't understand was that Bumpy wasn't just a man with a reputation. He was a living, breathing force that had become synonymous with Harlem's survival. He wasn't going down easily. As the squad moved deeper into Harlem, they could feel the weight of the streets around them. The people watched, but no one moved. The streets were quiet, the calm before the storm. And Bumpy was ready. Bumpy's men, positioned throughout the city, were already alerted. They knew what was coming. Harlem was no stranger to violence, but it wasn't just about the violence. It was about the respect that had been earned on these streets, and anyone who dared challenge that respect would find out what happened when they tested the wrong man. Dutch Schultz had underestimated Bumpy Johnson in the most dangerous way possible. He thought that because he had money, muscle, and connections, he could just waltz into Harlem and take what wasn't his. But Bumpy wasn't like the other men who had fallen before him. This wasn't just about street control. It was about everything Harlem stood for. Bumpy had spent years building trust, creating a foundation that no one could break, and for the first time, the man who had survived so much, the man who had outlasted every challenge thrown his way, was faced with the most dangerous threat to his life yet. But Bumpy didn't flinch. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every man, woman, and child in Harlem who looked to him for protection. And now, the storm was coming. And this time, the legend was ready to face it head-on. The air was still as the 12 men closed in on their target. Every step they took was measured, calculated. They knew what was at stake. But the deeper they got into Harlem, the more they felt the weight of the streets pressing down on them. Harlem wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a force that had seen more battles, bloodshed, and survival than most could ever fathom. And tonight, the storm was about to break. The hit squad reached the heart of Bumpy's territory. The streets that had once felt like an advantage were now closing in on them. As they neared the location where Bumpy was expected to be, they noticed the shift. The quiet wasn't the kind of silence that came before victory. It was the silence that came before something far more dangerous. Bumpy Johnson wasn't waiting in the shadows. He wasn't hiding. He was standing in plain sight, his presence unmistakable. When the squad finally saw him, they saw not just a man, but the embodiment of Harlem itself. A legend, untouchable in his own right, surrounded by the very streets he ruled. Bumpy didn't need to say a word. His reputation preceded him. His calm, confident demeanor sent a message louder than any gunshot ever could. But the squad, with Dutch Schultz's orders in mind, moved without hesitation. Tony, the Hammer Rodriguez, the squad's leader, raised his gun. This was the moment. The kill shot. Bumpy never flinched. The sound of gunfire rang out, deafening in the night. But Bumpy wasn't there to be caught off guard. He had already anticipated their every move. The first shot missed. But that wasn't the only thing that shocked them. What followed was a wave of chaos. A sudden storm that hit with the speed and fury of a freight train. Bumpy's men, who had been stationed throughout the neighborhood, sprang into action. They had known this day would come, and when it did, they would be ready. The hit squad found themselves under a barrage of gunfire from all angles. The men, used to shooting from a distance and dealing with a more structured battle, were completely overwhelmed by the speed and chaos of Harlem streets. Bumpy, still calm, stepped forward as his men advanced. He knew this moment, the moment where violence would be the only solution, was coming. But he was always 2 steps ahead. He was always in control. "Take them out," Bumpy said, his voice cold but with a quiet command that his men immediately obeyed. The squad that had come to kill him now found themselves surrounded. One by one. Bumpy's men neutralized the attackers, cutting off their escape routes, taking out their weapons, and rendering them powerless. There was no mercy, no room for negotiation. They had come to take Bumpy's life, but instead, they would pay for underestimating him. Tony Rodriguez, realizing the tables had turned, tried to make a run for it, but before he could get far, Bumpy's hand landed on his shoulder, stopping him dead in his tracks. Rodriguez turned slowly, his eyes wide with fear. Bumpy looked him over with a chilling calmness, his gaze unwavering. "Thought you could just walk in here and take what's mine?" Bumpy asked quietly, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Harlem doesn't belong to you. It never did." Rodriguez, realizing his fate was sealed, tried to raise his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, Bumpy's men stepped in, disarming him effortlessly. Bumpy didn't need to waste words. He knew Rodriguez wasn't the real enemy. The real enemy was the hubris that came with thinking you could defeat Harlem's legend. A lesson that would be taught to every man who came for him. Without a word, Bumpy motioned for his men to make their final move. Rodriguez was left lying in the street, his life as easily taken as the chaos he had tried to bring. As the last of the attackers were rounded up and dealt with, Bumpy's men stood tall, their loyalty unquestionable. The streets of Harlem had spoken. The message was clear. When the dust settled, Harlem stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. The sound of gunfire had faded, but the tension was palpable. The streets had seen something powerful tonight. They had witnessed a king fight back against the forces that sought to take what was his, and they had seen him stand unyielding. For the people of Harlem, Bumpy's victory wasn't just about the defeat of 12 men. It was a statement. It was proof that no matter how many outsiders came to challenge him, no matter how many hitmen were sent, Bumpy would always stand tall. Harlem wasn't a city for the taking. Harlem was his. The rival faction, led by Dutch Schultz, realized quickly that this was no ordinary defeat. This wasn't just about a single loss of men. It was about the collapse of their ambition in Harlem. Dutch had sent his hit squad thinking he could erase Bumpy with a simple show of force, but instead, he had proven the legend's indomitable strength. Harlem and its people had rallied behind Bumpy's legacy, and that would not be undone by a handful of gunmen. The police, who had been on the fringes of the conflict, saw the power shift clearly. They had once looked at Bumpy with suspicion, but tonight they had witnessed something else: respect. The criminal underworld had a new rule. The streets belonged to those who fought for them and earned them. Bumpy didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any boast ever could. When word spread through Harlem about the clash, the respect for Bumpy grew. The people knew that Bumpy wasn't just a protector. He was their shield, their voice, and their power. By the time the night was over, the streets of Harlem had returned to their usual rhythm. But this time, they carried with them a weight, a reminder of what happened when someone dared to cross Bumpy Johnson. The events of that night would resonate throughout Harlem for years to come. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a figurehead of the underworld anymore. He was a living legend, a symbol of Harlem's indomitable spirit. The hit squad that had come to kill him, 12 men, trained killers sent to erase him from the streets, had failed, and only one man had walked away from it alive. The immediate aftermath saw the power dynamics in Harlem shift further in Bumpy's favor. The men who had dared to challenge him had been swept away, leaving nothing behind but their bodies and their broken ambitions. Bumpy's reputation, already formidable, was now ironclad. His control over Harlem wasn't just a matter of criminal influence, it was a matter of respect. From the community, from the politicians, and from every man who had ever doubted him. In the underworld, word of the failure spread quickly. The mafia bosses in New York, Chicago, and beyond took notice. They had always respected Bumpy's quiet authority, but after the hit squad's disastrous attempt, they knew better than to test him. The streets of Harlem weren't up for grabs by anyone with a gun and a plan. Bumpy Johnson had proven once and for all that Harlem belonged to him, and anyone who tried to take it would find themselves standing alone. But Bumpy's power wasn't just in the guns he carried or the muscle he had at his back. His real strength lay in his connection to Harlem, in his ability to unite people and earn their loyalty. He wasn't some tyrant sitting atop his throne. He was the protector, the leader who made sure that those who lived in the streets, the businesses, the families, the hustlers, had someone to rely on. The aftermath of the battle left an undeniable mark on Harlem. The people who had already seen Bumpy as a king now saw him as their immortal protector. The streets weren't just a place for hustlers and criminals anymore. They were Bumpy's kingdom, and it was one where loyalty and respect ruled over fear. His men, those who had followed him for years, were now more than just soldiers. They were his family, and they knew that if anyone threatened their king, they too would be standing against Harlem itself. For the community, this victory solidified Bumpy's place as the unquestioned ruler of Harlem. His reputation spread far beyond the streets, as stories of his survival and his first leadership became legend. The hit squad that had been sent for him had come with the arrogance of men who thought they could erase what Bumpy had built. But instead, they had become the very thing that would reinforce his status. For Bumpy, the aftermath wasn't about basking in glory. It wasn't about parading his victory through the streets. It was about maintaining the balance he had worked so hard to achieve. Harlem's peace wasn't a gift. It was a hard-won right. And now, with the threat neutralized, Bumpy could turn his attention to the next challenge. Because in Harlem, there was always something lurking, always someone waiting to take what you had. But now, everyone knew no one could touch Bumpy Johnson. This wasn't just a story of one man's survival. It was about the strength of a community, about a leader who understood the value of loyalty, respect, and honor in a world where those things were constantly tested. The 12 men sent to take Bumpy's life didn't just fail. They taught the world what would happen when someone dared to challenge Harlem's king. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson wasn't written in blood alone. It was written in the way he carried himself, in the way he commanded respect without ever asking for it. It was written in the way Harlem's streets, its people, and its very essence were tied to his name. The message was clear. No matter how hard they came, no matter how many they sent, Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. Harlem was his, and it always would be. This wasn't about pride. This was about dignity. The dignity of a man who had fought for his place and earned it. It was about a community that had found strength in unity, in knowing that they were protected, not just by one man, but by the very spirit of Harlem itself. And in the end, it was Bumpy Johnson's name that echoed through the streets of Harlem, a reminder of what happens when a legend stands his ground. A reminder that respect can never be taken by force, only earned by those who are truly worthy.